Hello, welcome to the channel. I'm pleased to speak with Professor Jennifer Riggan, who is a professor of international studies in the Department of Historical and Political Studies at Arcadia University. Dr. Riggan is a political anthropologist whose ethnographic research focuses on political identities and state formation in Eritrea and Ethiopia. She has published on the changing relationship between citizenship and nationalism, the decoupling of the nation and the state, and the relationship between militarization, education, and development. Dr. Riggan's area of focus also include nationalism, peace and conflict in the Horn of Africa, authoritarianism, and education. Her current research investigates the effects of new ideas in global migration management on Ethiopian refugee policy and Eritrean refugees specifically. She's the author of The Struggling State, Nationalism, Mass Militarization, and the Education of Eritrea, which examines the decoupling of the nation and state in light of the fusion of government schooling with mass militarization in the years after Eritrea became an independent country. I'm pleased to have Dr. Riggan on the channel. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
So I'd like to begin with the book that you wrote back in 2016 and you published. There are so many different things that I could draw from the experience that you had as a researcher when you were working in Eritrea from 2003 to 2005. And you got to know the country through your work initially with the Peace Corps shortly after Eritrea gained independence. What got you interested in the country since that time?
So I went to Eritrea, as you said, initially as a Peace Corps volunteer. While I was there, I met my husband, who's Eritrean. And as soon as we had decided to get married, the war broke out. I was actually back in the United States when the war broke out. And from that point on, it became very difficult because of Eritrea's policies that don't allow people to leave the country for him to leave. And so I wound up having to go back to the country in order to do research for my dissertation. I sort of went back to graduate school in order to be able to spend more time in Eritrea, and then developed a research project almost by accident along the way.
It's interesting that you explain that you have an educational background in terms of your education, but it soon transferred into more of an exploration into anthropology and culture and nationalism. How did that transition occur?
I think I was always interested in questions of sort of political cultures, political anthropology. I went to a graduate program that specialized in educational anthropology and was working with some anthropologists who were looking at those kinds of questions. So part of it came from my academic development, my academic thinking. But I think I didn't ever plan to study nationalism. And I think in some ways Eritrea gave me that topic because it's such a profoundly nationalistic place, and how people come to identify with the nation and how they feel about the nation is such an interesting place to look at that set of questions.
Well, the overview of your research that you conducted for your dissertation was an ethnographic survey of the port city of Assab between 2003 and 2005, with a focus on teachers and their role in nation and state development. And you also conducted interviews with the then Ministry of Education staff and did observational studies of teacher training in Asmara. How did all this experience contribute to your overall understanding of the general relationship of the nation and state, and how can we differentiate the two?
That's a really interesting question. So when I initially designed my research project in Eritrea, what I wanted to try to understand was how teachers teach nationalism. We sort of have an idea that textbooks tell people what the history of the nation is, what the characteristics of the nation are, what it means to be of a particular nation, and teachers just kind of teach that unproblematically. And I knew from being a teacher in Eritrea, from talking to teachers, that teachers often had their own ideas, and they weren't radically different from what the textbook said and what other people said, but they had their own thoughts. They had their own beliefs. This happens everywhere, that teachers have different variations of what it means to be of a particular kind of nation. So I wanted to study that process and see what that looks like, to see how curriculum like civics curriculum and history curriculum, as well as all curriculum, were taught, and to interview teachers to find out what does it mean to you to be Eritrean, and what does it mean to teach your students Eritrean, to teach your students to be Eritrean. This is coming out of a long literature where it's understood that schools are the places where people sort of learn nationalism. They come of age as national subjects. They might learn about their nation as kids in the home, but school is really where they learn to be national. What happened when I arrived in Eritrea in 2003, and I'd been traveling back and forth to Eritrea for several years before that. But when I came to Eritrea in 2003, it was like the rug had been ripped out from underneath everyone. And that was the year that the government had announced that secondary schooling would effectively be fused with military training, that students would all go directly from, they added 12th grade to the educational system. They announced that all students would spend 12th grade in Sawa and do their military training, one component of it before 12th grade and one component of it after 12th grade. So this radically changed everything. They also changed the promotion policies. So students in secondary schools were much more seamlessly being promoted from one grade to another. Previously, students had to compete in order to promote from one grade to the other. And they also announced the closure of Asmara University, which is something that lots of people talk about as being a moment when a lot of people realized that the government was not supportive of education and that they might even regard education as a threat. So those events that happened on the ground really shaped what I was looking at, because I couldn't not look at, I didn't plan to look at those things, but I couldn't not look at those things because they had such a profound effect on what was going on in Eritrea at that time. There were also a lot of other interesting and complex things that were happening that shaped what was going on the ground. What I just told you, it was not that straightforward when I first started. Nobody knew quite what was going on. Everyone had theories. So it was my job as an ethnographer in that context to sort of tease out, here's what's happening, here's how people are reacting to it. But the important thing is that I arrived at kind of a moment of rupture, a moment of change, where no one really knew exactly what was going on. Students, teachers, everyone was extremely confused at what seemed to be a complete change in the educational arena.
Was your experience in Assab sort of a microcosm of what was happening in the country? Did you get any relevant experience from other cities in the country, or were you able to speak with others who had different experiences that kind of gave you insight onto how the system of education changed in the country?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because Assab, of course, is a really different kind of place. It's really kind of isolated from the rest of Eritrea. It's because of the large Afar population, it's really demographically a bit different. And also because of its proximity to Ethiopia and its relationship to Ethiopia before the border war, it's had a lot more Ethiopian influence over time. So it's a very different place than other parts of the country. Having said that, in that particular time period, 2003 to 2005, I did talk to teachers who were serving in other parts of the country, and I did learn enough to know that what we were talking about with regard to the fusion of the national service system and the educational system, that this was not unique to us, and the things that teachers were experiencing were certainly not unique. So it wasn't, from the educational standpoint, it wasn't distinct, but there were lots of things about Assab that makes it a very different kind of place that I've written about some of those elsewhere.
Well, briefly going back to your research focus, were there any prior documents that you had to refer to when trying to understand Eritrea as a country or as a nation, so to speak? Were there any books or surveys that you had to rely upon when trying to conduct your research in a manner that reflected the realities happening on the ground?
Absolutely. I mean, before you undertake a project like this, you have to read the history of the country extensively. You have to read whatever documentation you can get on policies. You have to try to find whatever primary source documents you can find. So basically, with a smaller country like Eritrea, and a country where there's actually not that much written about it, you have to do your best to try to read whatever it is that you can find.
Well, in your book, The Struggling State, you write a small but interesting anecdote that gives insight on the intimidating and coercive nature of the military environment in Eritrea. A teacher who regularly accompanied you and other colleagues at a bar in Asmara instead chose to sit and speak with a man you didn't know. But it turned out that that teacher's commander in military training was that unknown identity. The teacher said to you afterwards that he just wanted to, quote, talk to him as a person. Do you remember what the experience of hearing that statement from the teacher was like?
That was a really interesting event, and it took me by surprise. It was an unusual event. It was not something that happened often. But I think what that indicated, and what I was trying to bring home by pointing that out, is when we talk military training, obviously is a tremendously harsh experience. The experience of being in military training and military service, you lose a lot of your rights. Not everyone has an atrocious experience, but everyone has a hard experience, and everyone has the potential to have a difficult experience because you don't have any rights while in military training. So it's a very precarious time. It's a very vulnerable time. It's a very scary time, and everyone feels scared before they go off to military training. So what was interesting about that moment is that when we talk about atrocities or human rights violations or civil liberties violations, we often dehumanize them, and we don't realize that there's people on both sides of that equation, and there's people on both sides of that equation that are part of a system that's designed to have a particular kind of social and political effect. And the system of military training, Sawa, national service, is designed to have an effect that effectively militarizes the population, but also makes the population feel like they can't step out of line because they're under a sort of form of total control. And I think by this particular individual wanting to humanize their commander, they wanted, I think it was a sort of subtle effort to break that down somehow and to say, this is just a human being, that this was someone who had a lot of control over me when I was in training. But at the end of the day, this is just a human being who I can sit down with in a cafe or in a bar. And I think it's important to remember that that at some point Eritrea is going to have a reconciliation where there's a recognition that everyone has been harmed and oppressed by this situation, even people who are in positions to do violence. And in fact, those may be some of the most traumatized people.
Well, perhaps you already answered my next question, but did it give you a sense of how the military system in Eritrea is predicated on isolation and further dehumanization?
I think it did, and I think at that moment we didn't know quite how dehumanizing and isolating it would become. At that moment, everyone was still trying to figure out how bad is this. I think now it's clearer, the nature of the system is clearer, but I think in that moment, through someone thinking that they could try to break it down just simply by being a human being with someone else, I think points to the fact that one of the objectives is to make this a dehumanizing system. I don't know about isolating, because I think even the experience of being in military service is a collectivizing experience in some ways. Although it's so I should say this with the caveat that I've read a lot of stuff that's been written about the national service and done interviews with people who have served, of course, but I haven't done ethnographic observational sort of participant observation research with people in national service or military training in Eritrea, because that's not possible, right? So everything that I'm saying is at a step removed, but my sense is that one of the things that the national service program in Eritrea has done is to nationalize people, and it's as a nation building project. At one level, at least in the early years, it was quite effective because it gave people a strong sense of attachment to the country, but it also gave them a sort of almost negative attachment to the country, where this is what I think of as Eritreans being attached to the nation but not attached to the state. So because the national service system is so coercive and forces people to go into national service and stay there indefinitely, it's a very harsh experience. You don't have any freedoms or civil liberties or even ability to live an ordinary life. while in national service, this is a coercive experience, and there's a very strong sense of being forced by the state to do things like this. So even while everyone has to go through this experience, and that's sort of a collectivizing experience, that's an experience that kind of draws people together as we've all gone through this common experience as Eritreans. But at the same time, it's not an experience that creates support for the state. So, and again, I think a lot has changed over the years, but at least in the early years of the National Service Program, it did a very good job at nationalizing. But after the border war and after the fusion of the education system and the national service system, it didn't create positive attachments to the state. It created negative attachments to the state, but also this overwhelming sense of control, so that there wasn't anything that people could do about that negative relationship with the state.
Well, you speak on the relationship that Eritreans have with their country in terms of the government facilitating military service as a means to mobilize people. What is it exactly about the nation of Eritreans that exists in the military service that is different from the idea or the perception of Eritrea as a state? You speak on the issues that Eritreans face together as an experience where everyone sort of is, I don't want to say collective punishment, but I think that's the most accurate term to use in this context. What is it about Eritreans in the national service that incentivize them to belong all together in one country, regardless of their ethnicity or religion?
So what is it about that national service experience that, so I think part of it is that anytime people go through an intense common experience with each other, and an intense common ritualized experience, you could look at national service as an initiation ritual, right? That it's a way of you take, so in a sort of like classic initiation, you take people away from their ordinary society, you put them in a different kind of place, you make them go through certain challenges and practices, submit to authority, and then it transforms them. And it transforms them. I'm drawing on some sort of classic anthropological theory about ritual and the stages of ritual here, and there's lots of critiques of it, but I think it kind of works in this case. So people go through this intense experience, it transforms them, but also bonds them with their group that they go through that experience with. And then the idea is that then you sort of end that ritual and you go back to your ordinary life and you're changed. So I think in that way, it does create bonds around the nation. There's also, at least in the early years of national service, there was a lot of sort of rhetoric, nationalist rhetoric around national service. And I remember when I first went to Eritrea in 1995, in some of the first cohorts going through Sawa, there was sort of patriotic music on television and interviews with people in all different languages, talking about how great it was to get to know people. There are, I believe there's still tours for people of Sawa to show it's become a symbol of the nation, or at least one version of the nation in some ways. And that's very intentionally ritualized. There's a very intentional architecture of forging a national identity that comes through that process of attaching people to Sawa and to the military and to the military history. It's always attached with the history of the struggle, the history of the military, the values of the struggle. So by layering this really intensive ritual and this collective experience, even though it is increasingly an experience of collective punishment, you attach that ritual with that collective experience, with that sort of layering on of history and rhetoric about what the nation is. And at least on paper, that looks like a great recipe for nation building, right? That you've built a really loyal, fused collective. But because national service has become this experience of collective punishment that a lot of people think of negatively, it hasn't created the positive attachments, which is why we see still we have a really strong sense of nationalism in Eritrea and among the diaspora. But it's one of the reasons why you see so many people leaving the country, because they're detaching themselves from the state.
Why is national military service romanticized among certain subsets of the diaspora? I know, of course, that some people don't have to go through the experience of the very grueling circumstances that people in the country have to go through, but you do raise the point that it does galvanize people and it does get people excited about belonging to the state in the means of military service. But why is the national military service such a revered aspect of the society, especially among the diaspora population who support the regime?
So I have not done research among those particular populations among the diaspora who support the regime. So I can't say based on research. And there's many other people who you could talk to who could lay that out for you in great detail. But my speculation is that it's similar to the other things that I was speaking of, that the same recounting of history and rhetoric and images of the military, the same television broadcasts that are reaching people inside Eritrea are reaching people in the diaspora. On top of that, the ruling party has historically been very good at organizing in the diaspora. And at times, this has changed now, but at one point, if you were an Eritrean, say in the United States, and you wanted to connect with other Eritreans in your community, the only institution you could do that through was effectively a party-sponsored institution, or an institution that was either loosely or directly connected with the party. And there's a long process of that organization happening. So I think that there was a lot of organizing that led to that, coupled with the same sort of national narratives and national rhetoric, which glorified the military. And in some ways, it's also embedded in the history of Eritrea itself. Eritreans struggled for a long time for their independence. Most Eritreans are proud of that, even if they don't support the regime. So there's a sense in which I think pride in Eritrea's struggle and military accomplishments is part of being Eritrean, even for people who don't support the government.
Going back to the subject of teachers, you also write that the teachers who were accustomed to being the figure of authority had a particularly hard time confronting the military leadership, who were perceived as being higher on the hierarchy of state actors, which could facilitate the policy of the government. How important was it to highlight these encounters in your research as it relates to the concept of relationships between the civilian population and those affiliated with the military?
So I'm not sure. Can you rephrase the question a little bit? I wasn't quite sure what you were getting at.
So the teachers who you had experienced in your research were accustomed to being the authority figure in the classroom, especially with the students. But confronting the military leadership, for instance, whenever they had a roll call or a check, must have been an intimidating experience. How does that sort of reflect the relationship between the civilian population and the military figureheads?
Right. So it wasn't something that I observed on a daily basis, because there generally weren't everyday encounters between at the time that I was doing this research. There weren't generally everyday encounters between the military and teachers. At that moment, there was on your ordinary everyday day, there wasn't sort of an enormous military presence. So when that would show up was if there was a roundup of people for military service, which the roundups were particularly intense in 2002, which was, I was in Eritrea, but it was before I started my field work. But there was still a sort of sense of a presence of the military. That was a much stronger presence in Asmara and some of the other large towns in the highlands than it was in Asab. Asab didn't have a huge military presence. But I think in general, in terms of kind of how the country was structured, teachers were accustomed to being able to have a certain kind of authority over their students. They believed that was necessary for the students' education. And one of the things that the national service system did was to take some of that authority away, because the students knew that however well they did in school, however they behaved in school, whether they showed up for their classes or not, they were going to Sawa at the end of their education. That was a huge change from when the teacher was really the gatekeeper of whether they succeeded or failed. The teacher was the gatekeeper of whether they moved on or not. The teacher was the gatekeeper of what grade they got. So that the teacher had a lot of power, but the overlaying of the military system onto schools undermined teachers' authority. In fact, I should say authority rather than power, but teachers' authority in the classroom.
Did the teachers have quotas or any standards to meet with their students on how many are allowed to enter a certain subset of secondary education, for instance, or what exactly Are there any quantitative figures that you could draw from or think of that reflects this sort of amount of gatekeeping that you're describing?
Yeah, so before I don't have the exact statistics in front of me, but before 2003, the senior secondary school, which was grade 9 through 11, was extremely selective. So there was a big chunk of students who didn't pass from grade 9 to 10, and who or pass from grade 10 to 11, or pass beyond, or there was a lot of students who didn't pass from grade 8 to grade 9. It wasn't essential that everyone passed through each level of education. It was extremely competitive because everyone was competing for a small number of slots in the national university, and it was really tough to pass the exams and to get passed from grade to grade to get there. So it was an extremely competitive system. And then once everything in 2003, one of the things that changed was a system of mass promotion was implemented. So it was understood that students it should be facilitated for students to pass through the grades. And this was confusing for everyone. And nobody quite knew how to handle it, because teachers said, are we just supposed to give them their marks? And the answer was no, you're supposed to teach them until they pass. But it was a complete paradigm shift. Imagine, I think sometimes coming from the US perspective, where we sort of have this idea that everyone gets access to education until grade 12, it's hard to think about, but in Eritrea, everyone had access to education up until grade 8. And after that point, it was competitive and you had to compete. There was not a foregone conclusion. I'm sorry, I misspoke. It was up to grade 7, and then they shifted it so that it was up to grade 8 after the 2003 change. But in junior secondary school, that's when your education ended, unless you tested into senior secondary school. And then you had to score high enough on your exams to get promoted from grade to grade. So there was a chance that you could fall out of the education system at that point. And everyone wanted to go to the university if you did that well in education, but there was no shame if you failed out after a year, right? You still had part of a secondary school education. So secondary education had a very different meaning than it does here. When after 2003, suddenly everyone is supposed to be mass promoted. So without any preparation, without any warning, without any understanding of how they were supposed to do things differently, teachers were just simply told, you just have to promote everyone. Now, it arguably is not a bad thing to extend basic education up through grade 11 or grade 12. I think ultimately that's a good thing. It's a good thing to give people more education. However, the speed with which this was done, without any explanation or warning, without any understanding of how or why this was supposed to be done, it felt to teachers like the government was simply trying to shuttle everyone into national service without any regard for their education. The rationale for it was we need everyone to have a higher level of education, but the effect of it was that everyone was just going to wind up going to Sawa as the end point in their education.
I remember reading in your book that there were students who felt hesitant to even pass their exams, or sometimes failed intentionally. What was that experience like?
So so for the teachers were just kind of confused about how do we educate students when we're supposed to mass promote them, because education through competition was what they were used to. For the students, they wanted to delay going into service as long as they could. Some of them were quite young and not ready for service. So for students, what shifted for them was trying to work as hard as they could to pass, to actually trying to fail if they could, because they were allowed to fail a grade twice. They weren't allowed to fail more than that, but they were allowed, some failure was allowed in the system. And in the junior secondary level, students were allowed to fail. So the junior secondary level, which at that time went up to grade 8, that was one of the changes in the system, became kind of students who were trying to get stuck in a holding pattern. And they were trying to not pass grade 8 so that they didn't have to go into high school, because once they were in high school, that was a sort of smooth slope to wind up in military service. So if they wanted to just hang out in school in order to avoid military service, they had to do that by failing grades in junior secondary school. So it created a lot of problems for the school and for teachers and for the quality of education. You can imagine how difficult it is for teachers to teach students who are trying to fail. You can imagine that it didn't take too long before there was a huge age range in classes that teachers had to contend with, and some students who were kind of motivated and some students who weren't motivated. Another thing that became apparent pretty quickly about the system was that students who were going to do well in education would take an exam when they were in Sawa. And if they passed on to further education, they would go to one of several technical colleges throughout the country. People who didn't do so well on their exams would go into the military. So your path was kind of decided by that exam. So over time, students who knew that they would do well on the exams figured out that a good strategy was to go ahead, get your military training done, take the exam, and then you would be back in school. Students who knew that they weren't going to do very well on those exams were trying to stay in junior secondary school for as long as they could.
Was that coupled with the experience of the roundups that you were mentioning, the GIFA? I know some Eritrean students who felt like they were at risk of being conscripted into the service felt like they had a better chance of hiding or just abstaining from going to school rather than attempt and have to go to Sawa.
Yeah, and I think later on in the time period that followed my research, I think that became much more the case, because I think the government figured out how to get people sort of moving out of schools. I think that it was not a permanent situation that students could sort of stay in this holding pattern in the junior secondary schools. So eventually they had to resort to just doing what so many young Eritreans in Eritrea have done, and kind of figuring out how to hide from officials. And GIFA, of course, is the roundups are of course a key part of that, where the government sort of comes and tries to round up as many people as they can. At the time that I was there doing research, those two things were not directly connected. But they were both present. So they both contributed to this atmosphere of everyone one way or another being funneled into service.
Another experience that you mentioned in your book was this quasi-implementation of the Texas educational curriculum as a means to highlight the general dissatisfaction of the Eritrean teachers who were not given clear instructions on how to teach, including the banishment of lectures. Some staff described to you that their training was only a way to receive payments that they desperately needed, rather than to actually learn new methods on teaching. How did the lack of materials and academic preparation affect the education that the students received? And were you able to speak with the children and ask them for their experience?
Yeah, so I mean, in general, there were not a lot of materials for curriculum change. So the other interesting thing that happened in 2003 was that there was this massive sort of, it was pitched as this massive overhaul of the education system. It wasn't pitched as we're sending students to Sawa. The move to send students to Sawa was one component kind of hidden in this larger bundle of policy changes. One of those policy changes was changing the structure of education, closing the university, opening these technical colleges. Another system was shifting the grades around, adding grade 12. One part of it was sending students to Sawa. And another piece of it was this huge curriculum reform and all of this attempt at shifting the way teachers taught to do two things: to make education more pragmatic, and that was the language that was used, and to make teaching more learner-centered. Pragmatic education basically means sort of vocationally oriented education. So that's where the regional colleges came in. Learner-centered education is basically getting students more involved in their education, so that teachers are no longer lecturing at students, and instead they're engaging students in activities and lab work and projects and discussions and things like that. So what's interesting about that is that learner-centered education is usually regarded as a progressive form of education. It's thought of as a way to make societies more democratic and less authoritarian, because it breaks down the authority in the classroom. So it was curious to me that this move towards progressive education, learner-centered education, was being bundled with all of these other things, and was happening in a country that, even though Eritrea was not then what it is now necessarily, it was pretty clear that it was an authoritarian regime. But I think looking back on it, what's really clear is that that bundling of the policies was really both a way to get some funding from international sources for a larger policy reform, and the policy that really kind of was remaining standing was the effects of shuttling people into national service. So it's interesting that that's sort of what rose to the top as the policy that was most clearly implemented, whereas other things were not. So, for example, there was very limited teacher training to get teachers to rethink how they were trained. There was teacher training, but it was very limited. There might have been sort of like a week of training for some key teachers, and then a week of those teachers training other teachers. There were very, very limited materials. So teachers were supposed to do lab activities, and there weren't labs in some schools, or there were only limited lab equipment. Teachers were supposed to, one teacher was supposed to teach computers or something like that, and there wasn't a computer for him to teach on. So what teachers wound up doing was doing a lot of lecturing about these practical activities. Other teachers tried really hard to do creative things and to live up to this sort of idea of learner-centered education, and they really tried their best. But at the end of the day, it just became clear that nobody was really putting a lot of priority on some of these shifts in pedagogy and in curriculum and in teaching. And this bigger package of educational reforms was really much more geared towards national service and linking education with national service.
Well, later on in the passage, you also discuss how teachers responsible for those new subjects, including IT and home ec, were generally ineffective, with the IT teacher having almost no experience with the computer, and the home ec teacher attending school irregularly and infrequently. Eventually, the Ministry of Education acknowledged the obvious reality of a lack of resources and canceled the subjects by the end of the year, which causes students to not take other new courses seriously. Did that experience demoralize the teachers? How did it display a lack of preparation on the government's part to provide adequate education?
I'm not sure if it demoralized the teachers or if they were expecting it. Because it was just so clear that there was no priority being given to these things, and they would get these mandates that said you have to do these things, you have to teach these things, and they would say how, and then there would be no guidance as to how they were supposed to teach them, or who was supposed to teach them, or what was supposed to be done. So I think in general, yes, of course, the time period during those years was very demoralizing overall. But I think in general, there was a lot of humor about it. It became kind of ridiculous, the situation. So if humor and if laughing at something that you should take seriously is a form of expressing you're being demoralized, then yes, they were definitely demoralized.
Well, you also contrast the experience with the rapid and stringent implementation of the National Military Service with the introduction of the Warsaw-Ikalo development campaign and the official opening of the military school in Sawa. Was it clear to you that the revolutionary ideology of nation building through mass mobilization of the youth via the military was something that the PFDJ, the current regime, intended on developing?
Yeah, no, I think that was the point that I was trying to make before, is that I think when you look at I think what's the important point about all this other package of reforms that mass mobilizing youth was bundled with, when you look at the different levels of implementation, that when the Eritrean government wants to roll out something in a really organized way, they can. They're capable of mobilizing large numbers of people and getting them where they need to go and feeding them and housing them and doing what they need to do. So they have that capacity. And yet there was not the same level of energy, logistics, and organization and coordination that existed around the other policy reforms. Now, I should also say that when educational policies are changed in ways that are kind of trendy, and many governments do this, where they attach themselves to sort of an educational trend, they get some funding for it, and they implement it, but they're not implementing it particularly seriously. This is something that happens elsewhere, that there's long and kind of sad stories about attempted policy shifts that don't actually ever reach the levels of teachers and classrooms. So that's not an unprecedented situation. But I think what's distinct about the situation in Eritrea in those years is that some things were implemented with a lot of intentionality, with a lot of energy, and with a lot of, based on the objectives of those initiatives, they were based on some success. So yes, that revolutionary nation building project of mobilizing the youth. The government in previous years had done a great job at mobilizing youth for summer service projects. So there is a capacity for mobilization. It just didn't show up for mobilizing teachers to change the way they taught. There's ways that they could have done that, but that's not where the energy was.
Well, what's also relevant, maybe not in particular to your research, but in general about the education system, was the slow deinstitutionalization of the University of Asmara, with the refusal to accept new first-year students in 2003 and the recognition from student protesters at the time that higher education in the country was slowly being phased out in an effort to destroy the university. What was the perception of students at that time, if you know of any experience that these higher level students had in wanting to see their university essentially survive through this new rapid development of military education?
Absolutely. No, that was really, really key. So the closure of Asmara University was announced in 2003, and no one wanted to believe it. But then, sure enough, they stopped admitting first-year students, and then they gradually phased it out. And they very quickly started building the regional colleges, which were to replace Asmara University with a very different kind of institution, with institutions that were much more militarized effectively. They weren't technically military institutions, but you had to go there, you had to stay there, you had to check out. There were a lot of, it was not a free intellectual place like the University of Asmara. So this change, coupled with the shift towards sending grade 12 students to Sawa, those two things together, I think, indicated to people that the priority was on militarization and not on education. And those were all happening as part of the same policy, as part of the same policy shift, as part of the whole nationwide reinvention of education. So the closure of the University of Asmara was key in that process, in indicating to people that the government didn't have much concern about education, and perhaps even saw education and educated people as a threat.
Well, in the vicinity of your research as an ethnographer and an anthropologist doing field work in the country, another subtopic within education, which you again may have some peripheral knowledge about during the post-war transition, is the influence of culture in the experience of school children, and language in particular. As you know, the majority of Eritreans speak Tigrinya to some extent, but there are subsets of the population, mainly those who are Muslim, who speak Arabic as a working language to communicate as well. But what's not as well known, of course, is the other ethnic groups that exist in the country and their languages, such as Afar, Blen, Saho, just to name a few. Do you know of any disadvantages that these particular students had when they were in the education system? Were there specific events that you can recall that highlight the homogeny of the Tigrinya language and the culture?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting and complicated question. I mean, if I had been able to continue going to Eritrea and doing research there, that's actually something I'd be really interested in looking at. And I would hope that some other researchers are looking at that exact issue. Because Tigrinya is spoken by such a large percentage of the population, about 50% as their first language, and a lot of other people as a very strong, fluent second language, it's sort of become the default national language, although of course Eritrea has Arabic and Tigrinya as its working language, and has these other languages as other people's languages as well. But because you have such a strong domination of Tigrinya, which wasn't something anybody ever decided, it's just sort of the demographics of the country combined with what happens when you have demographics of a country that prioritize one language. Unless you have a very strong policy to push back against that language is going to be stronger. So anyone who doesn't speak Tigrinya is going to have a hard time and is going to feel marginalized and have a harder time rising through the education system, getting civil service jobs. It's just going to be that much more difficult. Another interesting facet of that is that English is the medium of instruction in secondary schools in Eritrea, and in Ethiopia as well. But many of the teachers are not, I will say most of the teachers are not fluent in English. And from everything I've heard, the level of English among Eritrean secondary school teachers has actually declined over the years. So what that means is that you have teachers who are teaching in English who are not fluent in the language that they're teaching. And so what are they likely to do? They're not going to teach in English. The text will be in English. They'll probably write notes on the board in English. They may partially lecture in English, but they're going to teach in the language that they speak. And if most of the teachers are Tigrinya, then that means that teachers are going to teach in Tigrinya, even though they're not supposed to be teaching in Tigrinya. So that's also a problem that will disadvantage people who are not Tigrinya speakers, because they have teachers who are likely to teach in Tigrinya. An interesting anecdote, I spent some time in the South Red Sea town of Tio around 2001, 2002. And what was really interesting too is in an Afar area, and students speak Afar there, there's a boarding school there, is that the Afar students there would not speak Tigrinya with their mostly Tigrinya teachers. So the teachers were forced to speak in English with the Afar students. So both the teachers and the students became much more facile in speaking in English because the Afar students wouldn't speak in Tigrinya. So that was a really interesting example of what can happen. The Afar students were pretty insistent about not speaking Tigrinya at times, and I think that had a lot to do with language pride. So the use of English, it's controversial and a lot of people are critical of it, but it does create some possibilities for another language that people can communicate in. So I think one thing that could be done is, if Eritrea is going to continue with English as the medium of instruction in its secondary schools, is to really build English language fluency for its teachers so that they can speak with non-Tigrinya speakers in English when they're teaching. That would actually really help with language equity, I think. And also, of course, train more teachers who are fluent in other languages.
Did Arabic ever serve as a lingua franca for Tigrinya speakers to facilitate communication with those who may not have felt comfortable with speaking Tigrinya?
Very, very few of the Tigrinya teachers that I was working with were fluent in Arabic. Some of them were, but very, very few, not enough of them to make that a lingua franca. Yeah, Arabic was taught as a language of instruction in the schools for people who didn't speak Arabic, but people didn't ever have the level of fluency in it that they could use Arabic. There was a time in Asab when Amharic was used as the lingua franca. There was a holdover from before the border war, and having many Ethiopians who lived in Asab, and many Eritreans who had been living in Ethiopia before they returned to Eritrea after independence. So Asab at one point had a very, very large Amharic speaking population, and population who felt comfortable speaking in Amharic. So when I went to Eritrea first in 1995, in the schools, everyone spoke Amharic. Which is a little bit of a taboo thing to say in Eritrea, especially now. It wasn't so taboo back then, but now it's fairly taboo. But it was really, and through the town in general, Amharic was the language that was spoken. Amharic serves a similar role to Tigrinya in Ethiopia, of course, so that doesn't solve the problem of language inequities. But yeah.
Well, Ethiopia is a much more diverse country than Eritrea is, but I do want to ask, maybe on the topic of facilitating the transition between education and the workforce, did ethnic minorities have any problems in integrating into the Eritrean workforce, and what conditions did they face? Were they even potential candidates to be conscripted into less harsh conditions, such as the civilian or infrastructure sectors?
You mean when they're after going through national service? That's something that there is not a lot of data on. In general, in secondary schools and in higher education, ethnic minorities in Eritrea are underrepresented. and that's still the case, that the Tigranian population is overrepresented in secondary education and in tertiary education. So because of that, Tigrinya speakers are going to be overrepresented in the civil service because that's where the civil service comes from. So that also leads to imbalances where ethnic minorities are not going to have as many chances to serve in civil service capacities.
I'd like to transition now to maybe a more pressing issue with respect not only to what's happening in the Tigray region of Ethiopia, but also to some of the research that you're doing more recently, and that is the topic of Eritrean refugees. They recently protested in the Ethiopian capital, Addis Ababa, to demand the local United Nations High Commission for Refugees office to find a viable path for relocation from the Tigray region, where most of the Eritrean refugees in Ethiopia have settled, and to ask for protection from all the warring parties that are fighting, including Eritrean and Ethiopian federal military forces and Tigrayan militias. There are incoming reports that the necessities of life, including water, food, medical supplies, and other emergency assistance has either run out or is being blocked deliberately from entering into the two remaining refugee camps, Mai Aini and Adi Harush. How important and urgent is the situation for Eritrean refugees from a humanitarian standpoint?
I think it's incredibly urgent, and you just did a great job of laying out the situation. But it's been devastating to watch the situation unfolding. As far as I can tell, it's a very fluid situation and very hard to know exactly what's going on. But we do know that 2 of the camps of the 4 camps in Tigray have been closed. They were destroyed before they were closed, and the people who were in those camps suffered tremendous atrocities from multiple parties and multiple sides before the camps were closed. Now the fear is that the 2 remaining camps, Mai Aini and Adi Harush, are poised to face the same fate, as they're effectively on the front lines of the battle. So there's concern that if the tide of the fighting changes, that Eritrean forces could come in and return all of them or some of them to Eritrea. There's concern about Tigrayan militias and even Tigrayan civilians who sometimes don't fully understand Eritrean refugees and that they're fleeing the Eritrean regime. And because those populations have been attacked by Eritrean forces, I think that there's a tendency to blame the refugees and assume that the refugees are, there can be repercussions against refugees for what the Eritrean forces did. And then there's accounts of the Tigrayan army conscripting people from the camps as well. So it's hard to know exactly which of those stories are true. There will be investigations at some point to know what's going on. But what is clear is that the refugees are extremely, extremely vulnerable from all sides, and that food is running out, that supply routes have been cut from all sides right now. I think a lot of the fighting has been about cutting off supply routes. And I'm deeply concerned that it seems like of all of the antagonistic parties in this conflict, that everyone's saying we care about refugees, but I haven't seen any party that's involved demonstrate that they really care about the refugees by saying, wait a minute, let's pause the fighting, let's open up a humanitarian corridor, let's get these people out of here, and then they can do what they need to do, I suppose. But I haven't seen anyone truly willing to pause the fighting. And I've even seen some messaging that suggests that parties can make themselves look legitimate by demonstrating that they care about refugees and paying lip service to caring for refugees. And I think everyone's done that this week as well. But if they really want to show that they care about refugees, they need to open up a corridor and get those people out of there.
The State Department said in a recent press release that the safety of Eritrean refugees in Ethiopia is at imminent risk, with credible reports of increased offensives recently conducted by the Tigrayan affiliated militias, but also by the Eritrean and Ethiopian federal armies. The Tigrayan regional government did release its own statement saying that they are committed to allow a UN-led independent international investigation into all the atrocities committed against civilians and refugees. And they've also stated that the relocation of Eritrean refugees be done at the consent and the respect of the Eritreans. How important are these announcements from the Tigrayan regional government in particular, which acknowledge the deteriorating situation for Eritrean refugees?
I think announcements are less important than actions. I think it's a very confusing situation, and I think everyone can announce as much as they want, but the ones who are engaged in the fighting need to come together for long enough to say, let's prioritize people, and let's stop fighting for a minute, and let's stop being strategic for a minute, and just care about people. So announcements are great, but I think action is a lot more important than announcements. And I'm pleased that the United States is taking a strong is pushing in this case, but I think it seems limited. What I know that the EU and the US have all tried to put on as much pressure as they can, but it's limited what they can do if the parties that are fighting are determined to keep fighting.
The UN High Commissioner for Refugees, Filippo Grandi, also released a statement on the situation in Tigray since the capture of the regional capital of Mekelle, where, quote, in the past weeks, hundreds of Eritreans have been arrested in the town of Shire. The UNHCR has requested access to Tigray and demands the immediate release of any unlawfully detained Eritrean refugees and asylum seekers. The UNHCR also received reports of other very serious allegations of violence against Eritrean refugees and called for both the Tigrayan regional government and the federal government of Ethiopia to launch formal investigations into all credible allegations of assaults and atrocities. My question is the potential of forced repatriation of Eritrean refugees in particular a concern that the US should consider referring to the UN Security Council if the conflict gets worse?
Well, some Eritrean refugees have already been forcibly repatriated. So it's already been it happened in the Hitsats and Shinelba camps before they were closed. That's one of the reasons why so many people fled those camps. So it's already happened, and I think it absolutely needs to be first and foremost a concern for people. There's a very serious chance that could happen again, depending on how things go. I'm not talking about forced repatriation from the Tigrayan leadership. I'm talking about forced repatriation from Eritrean forces in the area. So that absolutely needs to be taken very seriously.
Well, how important is it that the UN act and consider the worsening situation in Tigray for Eritrean refugees as a serious risk to destabilizing the Horn of Africa, given the severity of the conflict since November 2020?
I think it's really important. I think that the conflict's at a real tipping point right now. The refugees are a key piece of that. You've interviewed many people who are far more experts on the ebbs and flows of the conflict and have spoken much more knowledgeably about that. But I've been very, very alarmed in the past week at the way the conflict seems to be spreading throughout Ethiopia, the way it seems to be spreading regionally. And I think this is something that the world overall hasn't paid a whole lot of attention to, or hasn't taken as seriously as they should. The United States tends to have its focus on other countries that we deem to be of more strategic interest, but this conflict, if it doesn't get addressed somehow, is going to have global repercussions.
The new UN Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator, Martin Griffiths, who replaced Mark Lowcock today, started a 6-day mission to Ethiopia to work on the increased humanitarian response inside the country. And he said that it was important for him to start his tenure in Ethiopia as his first official mission on the auspice of the UN humanitarian global relief effort, and adding that the shocks that came on top of the already increasing challenges of COVID-19 gave the UN reasonable belief that what's happening in the region is of serious concern. And he's also expected to meet with high-end government officials in Addis Ababa and representatives of the humanitarian and donor communities there. With increased diplomatic pressure on the Ethiopian government, how important is it that the federal government seek a permanent cessation of hostilities?
I think a permanent cessation of hostilities would be a great thing to do. It's hard for me to think through a scenario where that can happen. But it would be excellent if they could have a permanent cessation of hostilities. But in the meantime, I think getting aid and food to people and figuring out how to protect refugees we are obligated as a planet to protect refugees. So they should not be stuck in a war zone. I think that's truly essential to do now, and that might be more doable than a permanent cessation of hostilities. Although if that could happen, that would be excellent.
Maybe this is a speculative question. The increased violence against Eritrean refugees has caused sort of a hypocritical response from the Eritrean government, calling for the complete withdrawal of Tigrayan militias from the border areas as a means to facilitate the protection of the Eritrean state. But it also highlights the very unnerving and deliberate attempt to undermine the Eritrean refugees. In particular, I have seen personally some Eritrean government officials refer to the refugees as economic migrants, for instance, of course, in years past, but especially in this time. How important is it that other governments highlight the hypocrisy of the Eritrean government in this particular manner when the refugees are fleeing from the Eritrean government and their repression?
Yeah, it is sort of a curious moment right now because the Eritrean government hasn't tended to acknowledge Eritrean refugees. And as you said, they've been referred to as economic migrants. I mean, famously after the infamous Lampedusa boat crash, the Eritrean government would not acknowledge that those were Eritreans. And there's been lots of examples of trying to distance themselves from Eritreans who have fled the country. So it is a sort of curious moment right now that there's this sort of grudging acknowledgement of the plight of refugees. It's baffling to me a little bit. I mean, one of the things that tends to happen with refugees, which is problematic, is that, and this gets at your question about statements as well, is that everyone wants to sort of use refugees to make themselves look compassionate and legitimate. And this is something that the current project, that piece of research that I've been doing with Eritrean refugees in Ethiopia, which, along with my colleague Amanda Poole, highlights. That there's a way in which a state that's hosting refugees, or even a state that is concerned about refugees, can make themselves look legitimate in the eyes of the international community by issuing a statement saying we will continue to host refugees, or issuing a statement saying we're really concerned about the plight of Eritrean refugees. We're issuing a statement saying, of course, we'll continue to extend our protection to the refugees, which both the Tigrayan leadership and the Ethiopian government have done. But I think it's really important not to politicize and instrumentalize refugees, and to remember that these are human beings. These are human beings who have the right to international protection, and have a status that should guarantee them that right. So I think we need to stop thinking about them as political pawns, because that will only make them more vulnerable and will not guarantee that they will have safety and be able to be protected in the best place that they can be.
Well, how does some of your current research on Eritrean refugees in Ethiopia given you some of the insight that helps you understand the particular circumstances that Eritreans face in the region? We do know of other instances around the world where refugees are an issue of importance, especially in Palestine and Myanmar. But what is it about Eritreans in Ethiopia that gives you particular concern, aside from your prior research? Or what are the circumstances that is unique to the situation in Tigray, but also in the region, that is important for people to acknowledge?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that you mentioned Myanmar and Palestine, because those two populations of refugees also have been heavily politicized, and also have not found rest. Right, they've been in suspension for decades, and have been in repeated danger because the meaning of those refugee populations, what they signify to different parties, is more important than the human beings in a lot of cases. And so they're at the crossroads of some very complicated politics in various different localities. So our research in Ethiopia started in 2016, which was the year when refugees were the issue, and there was the New York Summit on refugees, which Ethiopia was a co-host of. All Ethiopia and many other countries around the world made all of these pledges of these are the things that we'll do for refugees. Those pledges around the world later became the Global Compact for Refugees. Ethiopia later on in 2019 signed those pledges into law. So what my colleague Amanda Poole and I started doing research on, or what we hope to do research on, was what do those pledges look like on the ground? What are these shifts in refugee policy in Ethiopia look on the ground, And what we found was that while at the international level, at the global level, there was all of this buzz about, oh, all these things are happening, on the ground, there was really nothing happening, or there were some very small incremental things that were happening. The pledges were very slow to roll out. They were actually never rolled out, even though they were put into law. And they wound up being so entangled in bureaucracy that the pledges, such as giving refugees work permits, have actually never been actualized, have actually never been put into place. And a lot of other pledges that would be really meaningful to refugees haven't been put into place. So that's kind of the context where we saw firsthand that sometimes the idea of refugees as they figure into global discourse, the global system, is very distinct from how refugees are treated on the ground and what their experiences are on the ground. Now, none of that is to say that Ethiopia, during the years that we were doing research, wasn't trying their best for refugees. In many cases, they were. In many cases, they did want to do some things that were helpful for them, but the bureaucracies and the systems and the laws that prevented that from happening were so powerful that there wasn't a whole lot that could be done. And the discourse at the global level was something really quite different that made it sound like all of these things were going to be very, very promising for refugees. So I think that's just a case in point in how refugees can be political pawns. They can be instrumentalized. The idea of them can serve to create a lot of legitimacy for leaders and politicians and whole countries without the refugees necessarily seeing any of the benefits of those policy changes and those reforms. So most of our work is looking at how difficult it is for refugees who have to wait in camps for decades at times. And even when they're given, we look again, particularly at education, and even when they're given the promise of education, if you have an education, but you can't work, and you have no way of earning money, and you lose your refugee aid if you move out of the camp, there are lots and lots of educated refugees who were stuck living in the camps because they had no other way to support themselves. So they had a great university degree and they'd gotten this wonderful opportunity in Ethiopia to get a university scholarship. But then they were not able to ever leave the camp because they couldn't afford to do so because they weren't allowed to work or to open a business. So that's the problem that we were looking at. Of course, now that the war hit, it changes everything. It kind of the bottom drops out from under us. But I think that the key point is that typically people don't listen to refugees and what their concerns are and what their particular protection needs are. We were in the Mayaini and Adi Harush camps in 2018, right at the time that peace was being announced. And we talked with both refugees and Ethiopians about how they were feeling about peace, and there was incredible concern about the peace agreement. Refugees were saying, we're going to be vulnerable. It's going to be dangerous if the border gets opened. And when we talked to people who are working with refugees from the other side, they said, of course, the border won't be open quickly. It was open very quickly, and there were no protection concerns for refugees being taken into consideration. So again and again, refugees' concerns are not listened to, that there's a lot of talk about refugees, but their voices and their concerns never make it into that talk, because I think that refugees would have expressed concern about being stuck in those camps, even long, nobody could have imagined this war happening. But long before the war, there were concerns that about their safety, given the new alliance between Eritrea and Ethiopia.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned the peace deal as sort of a transition between the old and current Ethiopian government. What are the differences that you can draw from, just based off of the years that Prime Minister Abiy has been in power versus the previous administrations of Meles Zenawi and Haile Mariam Desalegn? Are there differences in the way that the Ethiopian government treated the Eritrean refugees, and what was the policy that you could draw from that gave you experience or knowledge on what is it that the refugees face? What are the challenges, particular in Tigray, but also in Addis Ababa, where many Eritrean refugees have since relocated to?
So it's hard to tell. So our research wrapped up really in 2018, and then I had a short visit to Ethiopia in 2019. So I haven't been there since then, but and a lot has changed since then. But my sense is that there's been a sort of subtle shift in commitments to refugees. I think, and it's not that refugees are not important to the current government. I couldn't say one way or another that they are. I mean, Ethiopia is a very, very large and important refugee hosting country, and it has made certain global commitments as a country, and it has to figure out how to continue to honor those commitments. So I'm not saying that the current government in Ethiopia is not committed to refugees, but under the EPRDF government, there was a really extended, concerted effort to put refugee concerns sort of front and center. And by that, I don't mean what I said before, listening to what refugees' concerns were themselves. What I mean is that Ethiopia was participating in a number of global initiatives, which were really initiatives that were very much about stemming migration to Europe, stemming migration northward. And Ethiopia was a participant in those initiatives, which meant that Ethiopia was making some commitments to hosting more refugees long term, and making it more amenable or more possible for refugees to stay in Ethiopia. So during the time that we were doing the bulk of our research, all of this conversation was happening about sort of how do we help stop refugees from engaging in these dangerous northward journeys? How do we help them understand that Ethiopia can be a safe and stable long-term place for them? How do we act as better refugee hosts? And this was just with the Eritrean refugee community. There were similar conversations happening about other refugee populations as well. During that time, the out of camp program, which allowed some Eritreans to live without assistance outside of the camp, was implemented. That program was supposed to be extended. Refugee scholarship programs, which many Eritrean refugees in Ethiopia took advantage of. So there were some good things that came out of those policy initiatives, but it wasn't ever enough, and there was still a lot of problems. But it wasn't clear to me that the current government was willing to sustain that same level of commitment. And what was interesting is that there was a recognition that it wasn't enough prior to Abiy taking power. Well, it wasn't exactly when Abiy took power. It was really sort of more of a slow erosion and a slower shift in things. And I don't think it was exactly because of Abiy taking power. There were a lot of other things that changed also, with sort of changes in how refugees got administered in Ethiopia that I think changed things. But things definitely did shift. Of course, now with regard to Eritrean refugees, all of that is kind of irrelevant because camps will need to be rebuilt. I don't know if Eritrean refugees will be able to be housed in Tigray in the long term. The situation is just far too unstable to be able to tell which direction any of it needs to go in. The bigger takeaway is that nobody is on the refugee side as much as they need to be. I think that they're of more political importance to various parties than they are of actual concern, and that needs to change.
One more question that I had about the peace deal, that it may be more of a political question, but it is relevant nevertheless. Do you think that when peace was established in 2018, the refusal to allow the Tigrayan government in particular to implement the peace deal should have been a warning that what we're seeing now was a precursor of the sudden policy shift in Ethiopia and Eritrea in particular? I mentioned that because you said that refugees felt like the peace deal, if anything, actually made the situation worse for them, because now that Eritrea had an ally in Ethiopia, there was a way for them to endanger the only place in the region that was hosting refugees extensively, to the degree where they felt safe. Do you think that the peace deal should have been a warning, or the Nobel Peace Prize should have been a warning for Eritrean and Ethiopian citizens that what was happening was more of a war pact?
I don't think I would go so far as to say that. I don't think any. Maybe some people saw it that way. I didn't necessarily see it as a war pact at that point. In fact, I've heard some accounts that as much as last January, the Tigrayans still sort of felt that not last January, a year before, that Tigrayans still felt like they were very much part of the process. So I think it is true that the Tigrayans would have been liked to be the ones who made peace. But I don't think they necessarily initially felt like they couldn't be part of the peace. I think the war really solidified that in some ways. But no, I don't think. I think that there were concerns for the refugees when peace was established, because nobody knew exactly what this peace was going to entail. There was no talk about demarcating the border. There was no talk about economic policy. Those were both things that spurred the conflict before. And typically, when you make peace, you have a conversation about refugees and refugee protection and the possibilities for repatriation, or the possibility to not do repatriation, right? Like, those are conversations that you have as part of a peace agreement. But this was a very hollow peace agreement, because there wasn't anything talked about. There wasn't anything substantive, and there still hasn't been anything substantive about the peace agreement. So I'd almost see it as a performative peace than a war pact. And because it was a performative peace, it made people vulnerable. But I don't think war was in the offing at the time when peace was declared.
Well, to close, I'd like to ask, when reflecting on your time as an educator, researcher, and a family member of the country that is Eritrea, what have been some of the takeaways that you've had regarding your work on the education system, but also on the country in general? Were you able to establish connections with students or other Eritreans that gave you real meaning and personal attachment to the very country that I call home?
Yeah, that's such a hard and kind of emotional question to answer. At one level, having Eritrea be integrated and such an integral part of my life, it's been a blessing, and it's an amazing country. It's an amazing people. It's a place that I have fond memories of and close friends and relatives from. It's a place that I love. It's a place that I thought I would get to spend a lot more time. It's a place that I thought I would take my children back to on a regular basis. So there's a lot of sadness around the fact that this place that I love and care about so much and feel so connected to can't be a part of my life in the way I would like it to, and can't be a part of my family's life in the way I would like it to. It's a constant source of pain for me that the Eritrean people can't catch a break, and that whether it's the situation in Eritrea itself, or the situation in Ethiopia, or in Sudan, or in Libya, or the difficulties that Eritreans have if they actually make it to Europe, and the difficulties that they have adjusting to life in Europe or wherever they migrate to. It's hard. And we're in a moment where the world is anti-refugee, anti-migrant. We're in a very sort of strongly kind of nationalistic moment where everyone's closing their borders and circling their wagons. And it's an ugly moment, and it makes it a hard moment for people who want to be able to travel around the world and who have a global diaspora. So there's more suffering and pain for the Eritrean people than they deserve. And I'm constantly hoping that there can be a break in there sometime. Eritrea can still be a truly, truly amazing country. I believe that. There have been some hard years, but Eritreans are amazing and amazingly capable of rebuilding. And you have to have hope that it will not always be like this.
Dr. Riggan, I'd like to give you the final word.
Well, I'll just say we've covered a lot of ground. Some of it is more like a distant memory for me. Some of it are things that I was thinking about and working on today. So apologies if anything that I said seemed rough or sort of unclear. But mostly I'm just really thankful for the work that you're doing to try to highlight these various different voices and to get news and information out. And thanks for giving me the opportunity to talk about my work.
Thank you, Dr. Riggan, and I appreciate you coming onto the platform.